Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies that Duncan and I can't be with you in person today, but we were keen to share the survey results, which are literally hot off the press, and will go some way to guiding the development of the Outdoors Scotland tourism strategy. My name is Jim Eccleston, and I've been managing this survey along with my business partner Duncan Stewart. We co-manage 56 Degree Insight and specialise in tourism research of all types, from consumer to business. We cover destinations, activities, branding, promotion, etc, etc. And we've been conducting this type of research, both client side and agency side, for a number of years. So today, in the time available, it's only possible to provide a quick overview of the results from the survey, but hopefully enough to demonstrate the wealth of data we've gathered and to show you how it can be used to develop the strategy and identify the growth opportunities in this important sector. So today I'm going to quickly cover the background to the survey, talk about the scale of the potential markets for outdoor tourism in Scotland, the profile and characteristics of these markets, and then a taster at the end of how we can look at this data in the most valuable way at the actual activity level, and then finish off with a few headlines from the survey itself. So, our remit and approach. Now, Stewart and Fergus will have provided some background on where this consumer research fits within the wider strategy development. But as in all research, we felt it was important to begin with some background details to the survey itself. First thing to mention is that the survey is amongst UK adults, the core, close to home, domestic markets. The survey was undertaken online using the UK-wide consumer panel over a period of 8 days in mid-September. Completion of the full questionnaire of 35 questions took around 12 to 15 minutes, depending on the level of detail people were able to provide to undertake that survey. Eligible for inclusion were what we would term as considerers of an overnight outdoors or activity-focused holiday or break in Scotland. In other words, non-rejectors. So nobody to reject the idea of an overnight holiday or break in Scotland, first and foremost. And the main purpose of any trip they would take would be to experience the outdoors or to undertake outdoor activities. You know, a range of activities were suggested: walking, cycling, mountain biking, water sports, or anything else that involved outdoor sports. And this was extended to include health and well-being breaks in the outdoors as well. Now, key in all this is that the activity would be the main motivation for the trip. Would not include people who would visit Scotland, but would only take the odd walk, if you like, whilst we're there. But we also recorded the proportions of people interviewed who didn't meet the above eligibility criteria. This means we're able to provide market potential volume estimates for the UK population. So in total, we completed almost 1,600 interviews with what we call eligible respondents, people who met that definition. And to achieve this, we actually undertook 4,707 contact interviews to deliver that full set of data. So basically, that's basically a penetration of 33% within the UK adult population. That's enough background. I mentioned that our approach enabled us to calculate the penetration of the potential outdoor markets for Scotland. So we're able to count the number of rejectors, both of activity holidays and of Scotland itself. And this means we can provide estimates of the scale of outdoor tourism and, importantly, the potential to grow these markets. So apologies, first of all, for all of the data on this slide, but it's really difficult to present this in any other way. I'm going to jump past the qualification questions around levels of interest in activity holidays and taking them in Scotland in particular. But the number of rejectors have been factored into all of the estimates of volume that you see on this chart. And again, I do apologise for the amount of data that's here. So, first of all, those respondents who qualified for the full survey are considerers, if you like, people who wouldn't reject the idea of an outdoors-focused holiday or break in Scotland. Were asked to indicate their levels of interest in taking part in a pretty extensive range of specific activities on the future holiday in Scotland. Around 30 or so of them, and they're listed on this chart. The table focuses on those who said they were extremely interested in undertaking each of these activities at some stage in the future on a Scottish holiday. It's a more realistic estimate of the scale of the market who would seriously consider such an activity-focused holiday to Scotland. So we've deliberately excluded those who said they were quite interested, as their potential to visit is that bit lower and softer. So what we have here are people who are very much convertible. So the first column is the sample size of people who were extremely interested or claimed they were extremely interested in each of these activities. And we're able to do very detailed analysis at the activity level for each activity, as the sample sizes that you see there are pretty large, almost across the board. The real benefit of the survey approach we took. Generally, we would say that samples in excess of 50 respondents are large enough to enable a degree of analysis. And as you can see, most activities have samples in triple figures, never mind more than 50. The middle column is the proportion of people extremely interested in that activity within the overall UK adult population, derived from our survey. We provided a range rather than a precise single figure proportion in each case, as it is a sample survey and we'd rather provide a broader indication of penetration. And the final column is what those percentages mean in terms of number of adults in the population. Effectively, this is the potential size and realistically achievable market size as well for that activity within the UK market. The pool, if you like, from which to fish from. Two activities have a potential market size for a Scottish holiday in excess of 5 million adults. Shorter distance low-level walking and nature and wildlife watching, whilst day boat trips, longer distance low-level walking, activities for well-being, mindfulness and hiking, rambling, each have the potential to generate in excess of 3 million such holidays in Scotland. All the other details on this chart, and when you see the full report you'll be able to look at this in much more detail. So how does this potential compare against previous actual visits for each of these activities? By comparing the two sets of numbers, we can see the extent to which there is growth potential by activity. So our eligible respondents were asked if they'd previously ever taken a holiday or break in Scotland where one of the activities listed was the main purpose of the trip. The data is presented in the same way here as it was on the previous slide, and we get broadly the same order of things. However, one thing that's important to mention is that we've undertaken a comparison of previous visits versus the proportion who claim to be extremely interested in such a trip in the future. So this appears here as a percentage of the likely growth, if you like, compared with previous visits. So the greater the growth potential, the higher the percentage, if you like. So the percentage is of those who had previously taken that holiday compared with those who said were extremely interested in that type of activity holiday. So what we see here is that fully serviced cruising holidays have a lot of growth potential there, plus 194% compared with previously. Holidays where quad bikes play a central role, plus 149%. Well-being activities generally, plus 116%. And that's effectively more than doubling what they've been able to achieve in the past. And sailing and cruising, also over 106, plus 106%. They've all got particular growth potential. And the data would suggest that really only fishing's the one activity where more limited growth potential exists. It's at minus 4% actually, compared with what people done in previously, suggesting it's probably at the sort of levels now that are realistic to maintain rather than any huge growth potential. I mean, I think the key point here is, most importantly for the sector as a whole, what is clear is that overall there's undoubted growth potential for the outdoor tourism sector in Scotland. That's a flavour of the scale of the sector and its growth potential. The full report goes into this in much more detail than that, and you'll be able to absorb the figures by activity at your leisure and at much greater depth. For now, within the time slot available, I'd like to give you just a flavour of some of the profile, attitudinal, behavioural information that has emerged from the survey. Just a flavour. The full report, again, contains a lot of detail. Now, as in all of this work, this profile information is most useful at the individual activity level. And I'll demonstrate that towards the end of this slot by choosing a couple of activities and illustrating just what is possible. But at this stage, I'm going to select some of the attitudinal and behavioural data and look at this across the potential markets as a whole. And we've grouped activities into some headline areas. These are shown in this chart here. So you've got the two land-based types. So the darker grey are the more higher adrenaline activities, if you like. The lighter grey, the slightly lower adrenaline activities. And it's a bit subjective because obviously things like cycling can easily be high adrenaline or lower adrenaline. we did get the impression that people who were choosing cycling within the survey were thinking of it more as a family activity rather than necessarily a higher level cycling activity. So that's why we've grouped that as lower adrenaline. But there is a degree of subjectivity here, and when we actually look at the activities specifically, you don't need to worry about that. But this is just to help the analysis here. We've done a similar analysis or splitting of water-based activities between high adrenaline and lower adrenaline. And then we've also grouped nature and wildlife watching and activities for well-being and mindfulness together and called that nature and well-being. And you can see the sample sizes in each of these cases are all well into the 500 plus. So big sample sizes. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this at all. I just wanted to illustrate the data that's in the report here with just a few slides on demographic, on socioeconomic groupings, both region of residence and how it varies by the different types of activity and so on. We're going to come back to this when we look at a couple of individual activities. I did want to illustrate that all this data is here rather than just simply not mention it. But the one I would like to spend a little bit of time on is looking at the motivations for taking an outdoor focused holiday or break in Scotland. We asked everyone, thinking about a holiday or break in Scotland where marine or outdoor activities would be a key focus, is there anything in particular which would be especially important to motivate you to visit? Now, we asked this question in an open-ended way, so people were able just to type in what was important. And we've grouped the responses here, as you can see. And I've used the same colour scheme as you saw on that earlier slide, previous slide, to compare the overall market in brown, so that's the one really to focus on here, and then the two grey levels for land-based activity, the two blue ones for water-based, and green for nature and well-being. And as you can see, the target market's provided a whole range of motivations. Everybody's different. It's impossible just to say that people come for one reason or two reasons. They come for lots of reasons. Only 5 reasons received over 5% dimensions to illustrate that point. But these are obviously the most important ones, which generally apply to most people. Good weather and sunshine at 16%, affordability, good price at 14%, natural beauty and landscapes at 14%. Now this is people putting all this in spontaneously, so they wouldn't necessarily have used those words, but that was the essence of what they were saying. Good accommodation, 10%, and a destination that was accessible and easy to get to, 8%. So these are all important, and accentuating these positives where appropriate and credible are likely to be motivating to the target market. Although with each activity displaying different attractions and specific motivations, dialing up which elements are likely to deliver greatest returns will be important at the individual activity level. And again, that. But of course, there are also barriers which need to be removed or reduced to optimise the potential for specific types of outdoor holidays in Scotland. Encouragingly, however, over a quarter of the target market claimed there were no potential barriers to visiting, 27%. So immediately that's really positive. For a quarter of the market, there's nothing in particular that's seen as a barrier. But there are, of course, barriers for others. And the two biggest ones you could probably guess: the weather at 14% and cost at 11%. Now, whilst the weather is especially challenging, it does indicate it's important. We do have to think about what we do with people who come for specific activities that are more weather dependent. They've got to have things to do on wet weather days and that can cater for them. And the ancillary activities and facilities around an activity are really important when that comes to mind. And we'll illustrate that in a few moments. But cost as a barrier is often down to perceptions or preconceived beliefs. And obviously cost is different from value for money, and there's lots of ways in which the actual cost can come down or can be seen as being better value even if it's at a higher price. So there's lots of ways that businesses can work with that. But we always need to be, and this is common in Scottish tourism, it's common in destinations across the globe really, that trying to show value is really, really important. Accessibility is a further barrier to 8%, and we should also recognise we're hopefully coming out of a global pandemic, albeit slowly, but the current COVID restrictions, this survey was undertaken, remember, in August. The COVID restrictions back then, and we've still got a lot of them in place just now, they were mentioned by 5% as being a bit of a barrier to taking this type. Now, respondents were provided with a list of specific features of a Scottish outdoors holiday and asked to rate each of them in terms of their importance to them on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 being not at all important, 5 being extremely important. And there was 31 features in total, which I'll show you over 2 charts. But I've ranked them in terms of the proportions rating each extremely important. So the further to the top of this first chart, the more important these things are to more people. I've also shown on the right hand side the mean scores out of 5. So if somebody gave a score of 5, their score is 5 obviously. If they give a score of 4, it's 4. If one person gives a score of 3 and the other person gives a score of 5, then the mean score between these two is 4. So we get a mean score across the whole sample and across each of the different types of people who are extremely interested in these different types of activity groups. So the higher the score, the closer to 5, the more important that is to them. So if we look at this chart, attractive scenery is the most important feature for people in our target market. Almost 3 in 5 rated this as extremely important, 58%. And the average score was 4.5 out of 5. It was even more important for those interested in the lower adrenaline land-based activities and nature and well-being. They got 4.7 out of 5, and they've been marked with green squares to illustrate slightly more important for those particular types of activity. Accessible lower level walking routes suitable for all abilities were also important. 33% said they were extremely important, and that got a score of 4.2 out of 5. But also above that we had nature and wildlife to watch and lakes, lochs and rivers, both of which also got scores above 40%. So they were the next two before we actually get to low level routes. Walking routes. So you can get an idea from this chart the sorts of things which are important to people and how it varies. Now, one thing that is really important to mention here, and hopefully it's very obvious, but this varies significantly by individual activities. It's not so immediately obvious by the groupings we have here, but when we look at somebody who is sailing versus somebody who is going for a rock climbing holiday, their needs are very, very different. What's extremely important to them are very different. Some things are common, but a lot of the more specific things are different. And that is something which will come through when we see individual activities in a few moments. This is the second half of the chart. So these things are more niche generally, a lot more activity specific elements, such as cycle hire facilities, around about a third of the way down there. Obviously, if you're not intending to hire a bicycle on your trip, that's not so important. If you are, it's extremely important. So when we look at the cycling market, that's obviously much, much more important, and so on. But hopefully you can see how we can prioritise the things that are important at the activity level for people from the particular survey. We also provided a list of more ancillary features of a Scottish outdoors holiday and asked people to rate each of them in terms of importance on a similar scale. So again, that 1 to 5 scale, as we saw previously. And you'll see here there was a lot of interest, first of all, in local food and drink to try. This was the most popular ancillary requirement, if you like, with 39% describing that as extremely important. Traditional towns and villages to visit, historic places to visit. So if we think about these wet weather days and so on, and you have a very weather-dependent activity, if you're able to, and we look at the profile of people interested in that activity, we can, in this particular question, we can see the sorts of things which you might be able to offer either in partnership with other providers, or that you can do yourself, that can provide something else that keeps these people happy, entertained, enjoying their break, even if the weather isn't behaving as we'd like it to be. So you can see the list of things here. I'm not going to go through them in any detail. The full report has all of this. So what are the benefits that offered by activity holidays and breaks in Scotland amongst the perceived benefits? People who are thinking about them, what do they think they're going to get out of it? Well, the largest proportion, mentioned by almost 2 in 3, was enjoying the scenery and wildlife. So irrespective of pretty much of activity, that is really, really important. So that's important when it comes to promotion. You should always, don't just think about the activity itself, but think about the context within which it's presented. And of course, it was especially appealing to those extremely interested in nature and well-being, as you would imagine. At 70% for that particular, the green bar at the top there. Relaxing and unwinding, that was the only other benefit mentioned by over half of the market at 55%, although peace and quiet, connecting with nature and wildlife were each mentioned by just under half. And having fun, spending time with the family, escaping the stresses of normal life were other benefits, each mentioned by over a third. Whilst getting fit and healthy and trying something new were mentioned by over 1 in every 5. And again, these vary significantly by individual activity. Now, a desire for an authentic experience has been a key evolving feature of tourism across the globe over the last 10 to 20 years. This research illustrates that an outdoor activity-led break, when combined with local authentic experiences, also adds to the appeal of this type of holiday. And given the nature of the Scottish product, I think this offers some real potential for Scotland to differentiate from other destinations. And as you'll see here, across the market as a whole, 25% said that authentic experiences alongside would make an outdoor activity much more appealing, and a further 40% said it would make it a bit more appealing. So, 2/3 immediately saying more appealing if there's a degree of authenticity there. Obviously, you'll get some people who are coming purely for that activity and anything else isn't that important. But actually, for most people, authenticity is important. So that could be local food and drink opportunities. It could be, listening to some traditional music in the pub next door, whatever. All these sorts of things, I don't need to define authenticity. It can be all sorts of things for different people. Now, within the research, it was obviously important to gather their wider, more contextual views as well. This helps to explain what might make potential visitors tick, what's important, what's less so. Now, with the global focus on climate change, extremely topical this week in particular, of course, in Scotland, the impact of climate change on tourism and how it needs to evolve is of critical importance. It was clear we needed to establish the extent to which climate change was a real issue and concern for our target market. Potential tourists to Scotland with outdoor activities, a key focus. Now you can see here, it's clearly, for this market, it is really important. For almost 3/4, climate change is seen as an immediate and urgent problem to be addressed. And this is even higher when we look at specific breakdowns of activities. 80% amongst those who are attracted by a nature and well-being holiday. So given its importance, those promoting Scottish outdoor tourism and individual activity operators themselves will benefit if they can demonstrate the practical steps they are taking to minimise the impact of their businesses and associated activities on global warming. Closely linked to that, obviously, is the whole notion of sustainability. Potential visitors were asked about how important it would be to them that tourism activities and associated developments are undertaken in a sustainable and sensitive way. So, although it's extremely important, it's slightly less polarised than climate change generally, although the question was asked in a different way. And those who said it was very important, around about 39% of the overall market, but again, much higher for particular types of activity, those extremely interested in particular types of activity. And when you combine that with the quite important, you'll see that sustainability is important. That does vary by activity, but it's important right across the board. And again, individual activity operators will benefit if they can demonstrate the practical steps they're taking to make their business practices sustainable in a variety of ways. Again, this will be appreciated by your partners. To understand further the likely impacts of climate change and sustainability concerns on specifics of holiday planning, our target market were provided with a list of potential future behaviours and asked to indicate the extent to which they agreed with each of them on this slightly different scale this time, on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 being completely disagree, 10 being completely agree. So it's an agreement scale. And so the questions, the benefit of that is you can ask questions which are a bit more less balanced, if you like, and just get the extent to which people agree or disagree with them. So the closer to 10, the greater the agreement, basically. And this does vary by activity, but there is a lot of consistency as well. A desire to choose local independent shops and cafes is the area of greatest agreement. 7.9 out of 10 overall, and even higher, a lot higher when we look at the likes of high adrenaline water and lower adrenaline water at 8.3, and also nature and wellbeing at 8.3. So that is really pretty globally appealing to people coming for a Scottish holiday. There's also high levels of importance attached well, first of all, searching out places that source local food and drink. So related to that, choosing independent local shops, but actually sourcing local food and drink, also 7.6 out of 10. But also ensuring that the economic benefits from the holiday go to the communities you're visiting. That is seen, that's obviously very sustainable, and that's something which visitors see as being important. So being able to demonstrate that as a business is really, really important. I'd be willing to take such a trip in the off-season. Again, spreading the benefits, spreading the pressures of tourism, if you like, across the season is also something which is generally something that a lot of these potential visitors would be up for. Now, there are some mixed responses as well. I mean, a majority would rather relax and enjoy themselves rather than think about sustainability whilst on holiday. And they will travel internationally in future despite the concerns of the impact. This is almost this value action gap that we often see in these types of surveys, where people say something's important, but when it comes to their individual actions, they maybe don't demonstrate that so much. And holidays are often put as something that's sacrosanct and something where you can indulge yourself and you forget about the pressures of the stuff that's otherwise important to you. And that's obviously something which is a challenge for the industry as a whole to deal with, but maybe illustrates, given how important sustainability is for these people generally, if the business can demonstrate that they are doing things that are sustainable, that help the climate emergency, then there is less of a guilt for the visitor who's there, and they feel that something has been done from their holiday, and maybe taking some of the guilt out of it. But obviously, it's a much wider issue than that. But that value action gap is something that certainly does exist. Okay, for the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to very quickly take you through an example of how you can look at the data at the individual activity level. I think this is where the real value of the survey comes into play. And we have the same you've seen on a few of the slides before. We can actually look at a lot of detail on people who are extremely interested in undertaking each of these activities on a future holiday in Scotland, as a main focus of a future holiday in Scotland. We've got big enough samples for each of them to be able to look at those. So I just want to illustrate how it varies by activity by pulling out 3 different activities. So we'll begin looking at nature and wildlife watching, then we'll look at mountaineering, and then we'll look at sailing and cruising. So let's begin by first of all looking at wildlife watching. So when you click on that box, it takes you to this slide, which summarises the penetration and the potential scale within the population. And then we get more of the profile information of people who are extremely interested in that activity. That appears in blue on all of the charts. The grey is the average across all of these activities, the average of people who are extremely interested on average, irrespective of activity. So this here you can use to look at how your activity compares with the overall picture, as well as getting a profile of potential users or visitors to undertake your activity. So in this case here, for example, age profile for nature and wildlife watching, you can see there that there's a fairly older profile than the average overall. I mean, you've got, 39% aged 55 plus, as opposed to 23% for activities generally. Household composition, more likely to not have any children in the household, so less likely to be families, for example. And then you can see the region of residence, how that varies, so that can help perhaps in some marketing campaigns and so on, and so forth. I'm not going to go through every single data point here. The same colour scheme is used when we look at previous activity holidays undertaken by people who are extremely interested in a particular activity. So in this case, people extremely interested in future nature and wildlife watching holidays. In blue, we see the previous trips they've taken to Scotland for each of the activities that are listed on this chart. And you can see here that generally speaking, they've been a bit less likely to have visited before for a range of activities. When we look at a couple of the other activities, you'll see how that changes. Then at their motivations and how that varies. So in the case of people interested in nature and wildlife, nature, beauty, lots of landscapes, affordable destination, good price, they tend to over-index, as does lots of animals to watch and wildlife, which you would expect given the activity. And then the barriers, not too dissimilar to the overall picture. And then those questions we had on the importance of specific facilities and requirements, I think is really, really interesting, because this is where you can see, well, the extent to which your activity over-indexes or under-indexes on these various things. You can see generally here, the things that are in red, the numbers that are in red, are the average scores out of 5 for people extremely interested in nature and wildlife watching. And you can see that in most cases it's below the average, so less likely to be influenced by some of the things that are mentioned there. However, in green, slightly above average, attractive scenery, nature and wildlife to watch, lakes, lochs and rivers. So that can help in the sorts of messages that you use with your advertising and marketing activity. We also look at the benefits that they will get from an activity, holiday or break in Scotland. So from a nature and wildlife watching holiday, more likely to be enjoying scenery and wildlife, understandably, connecting with nature and wildlife, finding peace and quiet, all over-indexing. The extent to which they need their activity to be guided versus self-guided, less so, generally, 17% guided, 27% self-guided, although a large proportion, it depends on the activity. And then authenticity, where does that fit in activity as well? We also didn't share this data earlier, but for each activity we look at booking channels, the preferred means of booking their trip to Scotland. Memberships of different organisations. So in this case, people with an extreme interest in nature and wildlife watching, more likely than average to be members of the National Trust or the National Trust for Scotland. Look at magazines they read, websites they visit, social media used, and you can see generally in terms of social media, slightly lower across the board in terms of using social media than people with extreme interest in other activities. And then the stuff I shared a couple of minutes ago on climate change, sustainability, how that varies by. And then we click back to this slide here and we go on to activity, which is sailing and cruising. Again, exactly out, and you can see again how it varies compared with the average. I'm going to flick through this very, very quickly rather than go through every single slide here. But you can see that slightly more likely to be to not have any children in the household. One of the findings there. In terms of previous visits to take part in activities, you'll see there that 28% of those who are extremely interested in sailing and cruising have previously taken that type of holiday in Scotland. So obviously that's much more than the average. But also they're over-indexing on a few other things, such as dayboat trips. They're over-indexing on that. They're over-indexing on windsurfing at 13% versus 11% overall. Their motivations, how do they vary? Well, their biggest motivation is natural beauty, lots of landscapes. But you'll see near at the bottom there, boat and cruise trips, significantly higher than the average, as you would expect, given the activity. And then the barriers, again, they don't vary from the average. But in terms of the importance of specific facilities and requirements, this is where the activity-specific requirements definitely come in. If you look in the middle box here, boats available for charter, that over-indexes at 3.8 out of 5 as opposed to 3.6 overall. But a long-distance planned cruising route, 4 out of 5, very important. Accessible advice on sailing routes and passages, 3.9 out of 5. Now, a lot of these are obvious, you would expect them to be higher, but it is coming through in the data, which is very, very important. And in terms of ancillary services, on the right, accommodation providing early and late meals is more important for this particular segment. If I then on all of those, we'll go on to this, click here on to return to the activity navigation. And let's look at the last activity straight here, mountaineering. So it's a smaller, slightly more niche, 0.8 to 1 million market. But the profile is very different. Much more likely to be aged 25 to 44, around about 3 and 5 are in that age group. More likely to be in the family life segment, slightly more ABC1 than average than C2DE, and so on. When we look at the previous activity holidays, what we see here is generally people who are interested in an activity like mountaineering are more likely to have taken lots of different types of activity holidays in the past, especially mountaineering obviously, but you can see they're over-indexing on lots of any of the other, you get the idea how this data activity and how useful it can be. Very much finish up with a final slide, which I think what I see as the key headlines from the survey overall. First of all, I think hopefully you've seen we've been able to demonstrate the scale of the market and the potential for growth. It's a very important market, and it's also got growth potential. And some activities more than others, but generally speaking, there is a real potential for growth in this market. So well worth the investment and the time involved in doing so. But it's not homogeneous. As I've illustrated in the last few slides, it varies significantly by activity in terms of who will come, what they're looking for, their motivations, their barriers, and so on. Large variations, and it's important that we bear that in mind rather than just coming up with this is the strategy for outdoor tourism overall. There's got to be an element of tailoring it to different activities. And there are some very clear top-level motivations for a trip. Good weather and sunshine, affordability, natural beauty and landscapes, good accommodation, accessibility. These are all important, as well as specific activity-related elements as well. Then the other thing we've discovered is that there are destination-level features that would make a visit more desirable. So 3 key elements were mentioned: a place with a friendly and hospitable reputation, a place with a fascinating history and culture, and a country with great food and drink experiences. All were described as very important by over half of our sample, and Scotland was seen to be particularly well placed to deliver on each of these areas. And we've got a very clear steer of what our potential visitors are looking for. Almost 3 in 5 rated attractive scenery is extremely important. Then you had nature and wildlife, the presence of lochs and rivers, accessible lower level walking routes, suitable for all abilities, and so on. Lots of information on that. There were many benefits cited about an outdoor tourism holiday in Scotland. A lot of them were quite generic, as well as activity-specific benefits. And again, I illustrated that in the last few slides when we looked at mountaineering versus sailing and so on. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are certain generic benefits, but there are also very clearly some activity-specific benefits that need to be focused on. And authenticity, I mentioned this a couple of times, this is crucial. A desire for an authentic experience has been key and an evolving feature of tourism across the globe over the last 10 to 20 years, and it's important for this market as well, and we mustn't forget that. And also, importantly, we should make sure that the sustainability message is very clear in offer. It will make a difference. People interested in this type of holiday do care about the planet and sustainability. A very, very quick run through, perhaps too quick in some ways, but hopefully you found it useful. Apologies again, can't be there in person. More than happy to take any questions by email or hopefully meet up with you at some other event in the future where we can talk about this further. But this has been very much hot off the press, and it's developing, and it will go into the strategy that is being developed, and hopefully we can all see the growth in outdoor tourism that we all desire, that will make a difference both to the tourism economy, but to the wider Scottish economy, and importantly to all of the tourism and activity operator businesses themselves. Thank you very much indeed for your time.